From the first grade to the fifth grade, I lived in Pacific Beach and attended Bayview Terrace Elementary School. I walked like the white kids, played like they did, but being such a minority, someone was always willing to remind me I wasn't one of them. It's a shame, but young children like myself are introduced to racism at such young ages, sometimes before they even know what it is. Now, elementary school lessons are pretty generic and bland. A few pages on the Revolutionary War, George Washington and Abe Lincoln. Though every time the subject of slavery would come up, a class of 40 white kids would turn in their seats and stare at me as though I was a 9-year-old authority on the subject. All I could do was stare back or down until they got tired. But for those few seconds, I felt like nothing, less than everyone else in the room. As those seconds that lingered like hours continued to tick away, I knew someone would piss me off after the recess bell rang with a not at all ignorant racial comment about my heritage. Was your mom a slave? Do you ever pick cotton? Finally, some little freckle-faced brat would get up enough nerve to put his hand in my hair so he could feel how kinky it was. This really made me feel like a dog. But that was my last straw. The fight was on. My only release was to punch, pummel, kick, and bite the one who dared touch my head. So in the winter of 1972, my dad retired out of the Navy and bought his first house in Skyline, a black neighborhood in southeast San Diego. Beside my family and church, I really didn't know anything about black people. The house in Skyline was run over with weeds, ivy, and tall grass. My dad worked us every day of Christmas vacation until school started. And I'll never forget that first day. My mother was rushing around that morning, getting my younger brother Greg and I ready when she began telling us how to act, with that Alabama accent that she never lost. Now don't go in here acting a fool. You're going to get your lesson, you understand? No playing or clowning in class. And besides, you act up, these niggas will kick your ass. I would be attending Daniel Boone Elementary School. The first day of school is always emotional in one form or another. For parents, the uncertainty of leaving their children in someone else's care, or the elation of being free the majority of the day again. For the children, these emotions are elevated into the highest form of happiness, sadness, anxiety, and fear, sometimes all rolled up into one, compounded by the fact that I was at a new school whose logistics difference made it more of a culture shock than anything else. With my mother's warning fresh in my ear, I approached my class with fear and caution, and Mama still by my side. I'm 10 years old, though, and I wouldn't allow her to hold my hand. All I could think of was who would be my friend, what games would we play at recess, and will my teacher be nice? This also being my mother's main concern. So before my arrival in class, my mother shared a few quiet words with my teacher, in which we found out it was her first day, too. Mrs. Nance, my teacher, was a white woman from North Carolina in her mid-50s. Tall, overweight, and wore cat-eye glasses with a line that hung them around her neck that glittered silver and gold under the classroom lights. The kids in the class who didn't ignore me all gave me their most menacing looks they had. I was immediately uncomfortable. I decided right then and there to keep my mouth shut, be invisible, and let what happens happen. After an hour or so, I raised my hand to ask permission to go to the bathroom. Mrs. Nance, with her southern drawl, said, "Y'all know where it is?" "Yes, I do," I replied. Just then, giggles and laughter slowly rumbled through the class. "He talks like a white boy," someone yelled. And everyone laughed until Mrs. Nance made them be quiet. I made my way to the restroom, embarrassed and feeling ashamed for even opening my mouth. After extending my bathroom break as long as I could, I left and made my way back to class. My classroom was in a portable building known as a bungalow. There was about 6 of them in the southeast corner of the schoolyard, well separated from the main school that had offices and cafeterias. These buildings had about 4 steps and a small porch at the door of each class. As I approached the class, a student came out, a Chicano boy who was easily the biggest kid in class. As he shut the door and stood at the top of those stairs, he glared at me with every ounce of intimidation he could come up with. He was tall with broad shoulders, wore a plain white t-shirt with black khaki pants that seemed too long, but he had the side seam cut, making the pant leg cover most of his black cross-country running shoes. His jet black hair was wavy and combed straight back. I hesitated when I caught his stare, but he came down the stairs and walked directly at me. I went left to avoid him, and he went right. When I went to my right, he went to his left. By this time, we were almost face to face, so I stopped. We looked at each other for what seemed like an hour. Though I didn't see hatred or meanness in his eyes, it just felt like a test I had to pass. And I guess he didn't find enough fear in my eyes, so we finally slid by each other without saying a word. Once I was back in class, I found out we were getting a nice distraction that afternoon. We were to be visited by two officers from the San Diego Police Department. At my last school, we had just did this about a month earlier. At Bayview Terrace in Pacific Beach, this was always a happy occasion. A couple of officers would show up after the teachers would fill the children with anticipation and excitement. Stories of heroism, protection, and safety. For a child in a white neighborhood, policemen were superheroes. When they came to that class, they were introduced as Officer Bill and Officer Tom. They had a very informative talk on what it is that police officers do for the community, how they love to serve and protect, and how we could always count on them in time of crisis or trouble. While each officer was speaking, the room was completely quiet. They had our undivided attention, and they could have told us kids cows could fly, and we would have believed them. After they both spoke, the teachers asked, "Are there any questions for Officer Bill and Officer Tom?" Every hand in the class instantly went up in the air. Little feet dangling under the desk swung as the young bodies twitched. Grunts of "ooh, ooh" rose from the room as the all-American California military brats and surfer kids fought for the attention to be first called by the officers. All but me. One thing I learned from the 1st through 5th grade was the look white adults had who didn't want to be bothered with me. Then the question started. "Officer, can you help me get my bicycle license?" "Of course. Just ask any officer or go to your local fire station." "Officer Bill, can I see your badge?" "Come on up, kid. Sure you can." "What's the proper way to cross the street?" "Do you get to drive fast?" "I think there's a bad guy by my house." On and on and on. The cute little questions poured from the mouths and minds of the everyday all-American 10-year-olds from Bayview Terrace in Pacific Beach. But now, I'm in Skyline. At Boone Elementary School, I figured this would be nice to listen to the officers for a second time in as many months. At least I wouldn't be doing any math or spelling or anything boring like that. After a lonely lunch break in which no one would talk to me or eat with me, compounded by the fact that my brother Greg had a different lunch hour than mine, I eagerly returned to class just in hopes of getting this day over with. Within a few minutes of returning to class, two large white police officers entered the classroom, looking eager to speak with all the young, impressionable children. After a short introduction from Mrs. Nance, Officer Bill and Tom stood front and center in front of the class, and before either could get a word out, someone from the class shouted, "Why did you guys beat up my brother?" Someone else yelled, "Y'all shot my cousin." "Why y'all always messing with us?" My head was spinning, moving low as though my neck was on a swivel. Before I knew it, there were no more questions. 10-year-old kids were standing up saying things like, "I hate cops. Who do you think you are? Y'all ain't shit. Go to hell, pigs." Fast, quick, and in such rapid succession, you may have thought it was rehearsed. I watched and listened like I was at a professional tennis match. Now, my mother could curse with the best, but these kids were on a whole different level. I didn't know 10 and 11-year-olds could say so many fuck yous, motherfuckers, and sons of bitches. Finally, I look at Officer Bill and Tom, whose complexion were beet red by now, and a collective flow of steam pulsing from their collar lines, ears, and the tops of their heads. Never mind that neither officer had said a single word during the whole tirade. Bill seriously seemed to be contemplating pulling out his service weapon and putting a few holes in the ceiling, while Tom looked as though he couldn't wait to get us out on the street. The kids in class yelled at they finally looked at each other and decided to leave. The kids in that class yelled at those cops long after they left the classroom. Then they began slapping five, pumping fists like they had won the Super Bowl. They had really stuck it to the man. This seemed to be a great victory in such young lives. As for me, I didn't think my eyes had ever been so wide for so long without blinking. Nor had a jaw hung open so low for so long. For years, though, I would be reminded that we had run the police out of that class, but not out of that hood. For the next few months, life in Skyline became pretty good for me, with the exception of two major hurdles. First, Mrs. Nance, who you might have thought we were a match made in heaven, being arriving on the same day and all. I arrived at Boone School with a 12th grade reading level, and every afternoon she would put us in a reading circle and took pleasure in helping the other children who struggled with 3- and 4-letter words. When it was my turn to read, I would cut off her attempts to help me because I didn't need it. This really seemed to piss her off. To the point she finally had me set up for corporal punishment. The dreaded paddle, you know it. Secondly, there was the matter of Officers Bill and Tom, who made it a point to drive through the neighborhood as we were walking home from school. Once they spotted anyone from that 5th grade class, we were immediately stopped, searched, slammed against squad cars, and always asked for ID, which of course none of us had. This would go on for the next 2 years until I was bused to a school on the north side of Interstate 8. Thank you for listening. Peace.
Give it up for Michael Billingsley.